So let's get started. Andy is the Senior Forestry Director at Eco-Foresters and a North Carolina Registered Forester. Andy, with so much to talk about, where would you like to start?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of start with saying that, the Helene was a huge impact to all of us in so many ways. And a lot of the initial responses focused on basic human needs, getting people power and water and safety and all that stuff. And so it's taken a while for us to shift to really looking at the impacts on the natural landscape and the forests here. And they've definitely taken a major blow as well. And the biggest impact long lasting is going to be people that had land disturbance. If you had any kind of landslide or debris flow, certainly that's major when there's, bare soil now. If you had an old forest road that wasn't well designed, like a lot of them weren't back in the day, there's erosion off those roads. So even that's a significant issue ongoing, just erosion leading to water quality issues. That's the biggest impact when there's land disturbance to it. There's also, tons and tons of trees knocked down or broken or damaged. And that certainly has damaged the forest, but the forest will regrow. Forests regrow. It does take years, even decades, to regrow big mature trees. Soil takes 100 years to regrow an inch of soil sometimes. So the soil is going to regrow much more slowly naturally. So that needs the biggest help and concern. And a lot of it was the trees that were the tallest, had the biggest crowns up there that caught a lot of wind. Some of those really big old trees are the ones that got knocked over, leaving behind some of the smaller, not as big, not as vigorous trees with smaller crowns on them that weren't damaged. So it's kind of did what we call in forestry a high grade, which is a typical logging practice, because the biggest trees have the most value. So loggers will often just target those really big trees, and those are often the trees with the best genetics, best adapted trees, and take out the biggest and best trees. The storm did that too, unfortunately. Has degraded our forests. Some of those really big old trees are no longer here anymore. Another big risk people are talking about, of course, is fire, forest fire, wildfires. And while there's no greater chance of a fire happening, if a fire does happen, we could definitely see more extreme fire in these areas, because there's a lot of more fuel on the ground in the woods now with all these downed trees everywhere. So again, there's not a great risk of a fire happening, but if it did happen, it could be a more severe fire for sure. And then all this disturbance have let in a lot more sun, opened up a lot more growing space, and plants, nature abhors a vacuum. So something is going to come and grow in those spaces. The big question is it going to be desirable native plants that are going to come in? In some places, that is going to happen. If you had non-native invasive plants in those areas beforehand, and they weren't treated, and then the storm comes in, the non-native invasive plants are going to grow even faster than the native plants. So we could see in areas that haven't been controlled, non-native invasive plants becoming a much bigger issue. And Krishun is going to talk about that in a few minutes. I'm not going to do that, but that's one thing there. But again, there's going to be lots of regeneration. This spring is going to be very exciting. There could be some wonderful new blooms of wildflowers and grasses and tons of young trees. You can get as many as 10,000 trees per acre coming in. They can be as thick as blades of grass coming in. So, but we got to make sure that's managed, that we have a desirable forest coming back. And hopefully the forest, in some areas definitely can come back as good or even better than it was before. It'll take time, but nature is resilient, and we can do a lot to help with that. So we're going to talk what you can do to help with that. So that's kind of the basics of what I've seen in terms of damage out there and what the impacts on forests have been from Hurricane Helene. And I'll just go ahead and jump into some of the questions we have online here posed. So people talking about downed trees on their property, and hundreds of downed trees some places, and it really varied greatly across the landscape. Some people had very minimal impacts and just had a little microburst that might have knocked down an acre of trees here or there, a much wider area of forest that's intact. And that's somewhat a natural level. This was a natural disturbance, albeit really an extreme version. The more extreme weather events we're having with the climate changing is really impacting things more dramatically. So it didn't just have, this is the worst disturbance in recorded history around here. So it was above and beyond the natural level of disturbance. Hurricanes came through here every 20 years or so, and they would often knock down a small group of trees, an acre or less, in scattered areas, but not knock down these huge areas of forest. So that's a big concern. And in these areas, the number one thing to do with down trees is to be fire wise. And that means especially around houses or structures, to make sure that there is no downed dead wood within 30 feet of a structure, especially of your house. So that's something that can be done fairly easily. May need some help for bigger trees, but just that 30-foot buffer is a minimum to clear away any dead down trees on the ground, anything that could catch fire at least 30 feet away from your house. That can be especially true from areas that are downhill of your house, especially in the steep mountain terrain. Fires go a lot faster uphill in the mountains. So if you have those fuels below your house, you may want to push them more than 30 feet away. And if they're bigger, if you have, big logs, big trees that are over a foot in diameter, you may want to get them as close to be 100 feet away from your house to really have a safe, defensible space they talk about with being fire-wise around your house. There's a great website if you go to resistwildfirenc.org or just Google the Firewise NC. It'll come up, and it has a lot of good resources about how to make your house more fire-wise, make it more safe for fire. So the number one thing, again, is getting that fuel away from the house, maybe up to 100 feet away downhill side. If it's uphill or in the middle of a large forested area and there's not residences above there, it's much less of a risk. It still could burn hot, but that's in a natural area. Again, wildfire is and has been for centuries and eons a natural disturbance around here too. So it's not a bad thing. Naturally, obviously, it can be a bad thing if it's anywhere around human values. So that's the number one thing to be aware of there. So with the trees, you don't have to get rid of all of them. Clear them away from your house. If there are areas that are accessible, then you can do some work there. And one of the other key things is to make sure you are clearing access into your forest. So if you had an old forest road, those old forest roads are fire breaks, are fuel breaks. If fire breaks out, the roads can actually be a place where they can stop the fire. It also allows access for emergency responders to get in and put out those fires before they get too close to your house or your neighbor's houses. So it's really important if you had old forest roads or even trails to reopen them so access is reestablished. So if a fire does start and it gets more severe, they can get in there and try and control that fire. So reestablishing access into your forest so there can be response, and also those fuel breaks, those fire breaks. Roads serve as a great fuel break and fire break in the woods to stop fire from spreading, which is, again, the key. That's the key thing, is stop it from spreading into areas we don't want it to do, where we can't, it's going to put people's lives or homes at risk. We want to make sure we stop that. So again, the risk of wildfire is real if it does happen. So you want to have those access restored around things there. But again, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a forest. These forest fires are a natural occurrence. They can actually benefit the forest greatly. But we could have some more extreme ones here if fires do start. So that's the key thing there. I think I answered most of those things here. I mean, again, defensible space around your house, and then fire lines where you're worried about having heavy fuel loads, like around the parkway, other natural areas. There has been significant damage, and you're not going to be able to clear all the down trees that are around you. There's just way too many. So having fuel breaks, fire breaks, those road access in to have a barrier between you and where those fuels are, especially again, those fuels are downhill from you, is a much greater risk than if they're uphill from you on things. So that's the main thing with fire risk there. The other thing I mentioned earlier as being a high risk was erosion and bare soil. If you had landslides or debris flows, I've seen some of those. It's really dramatically changed some landscapes, and that bare soil is going to keep eroding with each rainfall that happens there. So we want to, if it's an actual landslide or a debris flow, we want to make sure we can reseed those areas. And you can put down annual ryegrass. Is actually very cheap to buy. It's about $1 to buy a pound of seed at most local Lowe's and Home Depots. And it germinates very quickly within like 3 days usually. So you can spread that seed on the ground, have something there to stabilize that soil and stop that erosion. And then eventually you want to try and get a more diverse mix of native plants in there. You can buy native seed mixes to spread on things there, but you got to make sure that they're also stabilized, mulched in. If it's a steep area, you may want to put down some coconut fiber matting or something over those seeds to hold them in place too, so the seed doesn't just wash away with the next rainstorm. But stop that erosion as soon as possible, and then eventually looking at getting woody plants, trees or shrubs. And if it's a stream side area, there are something called live staking you can do. You can take a cutting of fresh trees that grow in those riverside areas and actually just stick those live stakes in the ground. And there's a great resource on that we can share on small stream restoration area, even some real simple things that landowners can do to them, in their own little backyard stream. You can do some of these actions. We can provide more information on that. But getting those bare soil areas stabilized. And if you have an old road, a lot of the old roads are poorly built and were eroding anyway, and the hurricane have accelerated that erosion greatly. You may need to have some road work done if it's a steep old road to have it regraded and put water control structures in, the kind of rolling dips and water bars in to get the water off the road. So it's not just going down the road. I've seen roads and even people's driveways that got pretty well washed away by Helene. And now we need to rebuild them and rebuild them better so they're able to withstand it. And someone asking, what can we do to have trees that can withstand Helene or build roads to withstand Helene? And a storm that extreme, the most powerful storm in recorded history, there's nothing that can withstand the full force of that. We had 140 mile an hour winds in places. No tree is going to survive that. Areas that were totally flattened. But there are trees that are more resilient in general. So usually it's the deeper rooted trees like oaks and hickories and things like shortleaf pine are a couple trees that come to mind in terms of having really deep roots that are drought tolerant, they're fire tolerant. But those trees also blew down during Helene because of such a severe event. So there's no bulletproof tree we have that can withstand a full hurricane. But there certainly are trees that are more adapted and better to that, and also better adapted to climate change with more severe droughts and more severe potential wildfires. There are trees that are better adapted to handle those future extreme weather conditions. But those are a couple main things there. I think that's kind of quick rundown of some of the pre-questions we had. And I'll turn it over back to Ellie and Krishun here to talk about some other things.
Hi there, my name is Krishun and I am our Forest Stewardship Director over here at Eco Foresters, and I'm excited to get to chat with y'all today during National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So let's get into it. I'm going to answer a few preliminary questions that we had come through. So I'll read the question prompt first and then I'll give y'all my answer. So our first question that we had come through was, what invasive plants should I be most concerned about? So in my opinion, invasive vine species such as bittersweet, kudzu, and wisteria, just to name a few, these are public enemy number one. These plants should be prioritized because of their ability to rapidly climb mature trees and eventually damage, deform, and ultimately kill these trees. They can also quickly spread over the ground, rooting themselves at multiple points called nodes and furthering the spread along the ground, eventually carpeting that space. And once they've reached this point of carpeting the ground, they can form monocultures and make it very difficult for native plants to germinate. I also think that we're going to see an uptick in invasive trees like princess tree and tree of heaven, trying to take over these newly sunlit barren soil spaces after Helene. And that's because their seeds are wind dispersed and they are able to travel great distances. And lastly, Japanese knotweed is another plant that I'll make a plug for stopping in its tracks if you can. Japanese knotweed is a woody, non-woody, almost bamboo-like shrub in that it has hollow stems and it forms dense root masses. You'll often see it invading stream banks, and once established, it can be very difficult to control. And it's really unhealthy for aquatic habitats because it also crowds out room for native plants that we would like to see established on those stream banks. It can ultimately stop up the flow of waterways, and it doesn't provide very much shade. And in turn, this causes water temperatures to rise, which is not good for our invertebrate and fish species who require cool temperatures to thrive in our stream habitats. The next question that we had come through: when is the best time to control invasive plants? And so I'll say it really depends on the species in question that you're trying to control, but a good general blanket time frame would be at the height of growing season, and we'll call that June for our region here in Western North Carolina, through the early fall. And for our region, I would say that that's through mid-October. That being said, many woody invasive trees, shrubs, and vines can also be controlled in the dormant season via chemical cut stump or hack and squirt methods, as long as the air temperatures are mild and the ground has not been consistently frozen. Winter can actually be a great time to deal with woody invasives because it can be a more comfortable temperature for working outdoors. And you find that you aren't having to fight tooth and nail to get through these thick, lush green vegetation that are growing in the forest understory. I find that once you have an eye for identifying invasive plants, that visibility is actually easier for me in the wintertime to spy many of these invasive woody species. And I'll also make a plug that March is actually a really great time to deal with multiflora rose, and that's because it's a invasive plant that leaves out very quickly, and so it makes it really obvious to find and spot them in March. Our next question: herbicide makes me nervous. Is it necessary to use? What can I do to control invasive plants without using herbicides? Completely understandable to be wary of herbicides, and you should always have a healthy dose of caution whenever working with any sort of chemical formulation. Herbicides, when used correctly, can be a very effective tool for controlling invasive plants. And while it is a tool that I do employ and that I do recommend for long-term and improved control, I do also recognize and respect that it isn't the tool for everyone. So if herbicide use is not for you, there are mechanical and cultural methods that you can use to combat your invasive species infestation. One of those is hand pulling, and hand pulling is an option I would recommend to do after a recent rain so that the soil is softer, making it easier to pull. You'll just want to be sure that you have a plan in mind for what you'd like to do with your pulled weeds, whether that's bagging them up and taking them to a landfill or burning them on site. You just want to have a plan to deal with those afterwards to not further the spread. There are also tools out there like weed wrenches, polar bears, extractigators that can assist with pulling out some of the larger, more deeply rooted invasive plants like Chinese privet. Just be sure that if you're using these mechanical methods, that you monitor the area weeks later and in future growing seasons for any potential resprouting in case root fragments broke off when you were pulling them, or there's always the possibility that residual seeds were still left in the soil and they could eventually germinate. Mowing or cutting practices can also be an option to manage your invasive plants. It won't kill the plant outright, but you will have at least top killed the mature plant so that it can't reproduce more seed later on that year. And if you are very diligent and stay dedicated to mowing and cutting for several seasons, depending on the species, you can eventually exhaust that plant's energy reserves, which will eventually kill the plant. If you choose to go with mowing, I highly recommend doing this at least a couple of times a year minimum, again, based on the species and how severe the infestation is. It's also really important to educate yourself regarding what time of year your target species puts on seed heads, because you'll definitely not want to mow them down while they have viable seeds on the plant, because you could risk further spreading more seed. Other options could include burning the area on a regular scheduled interval. Similarly to mowing, this will at least top kill most plants and make accessing that area easier in the future. It'll make room for more native plants to grow, and it could eventually exhaust and kill the root system of these invasive plants. Another option where you don't have to use herbicide is called solarization. And so this is a method that can be employed and it's usually best to use on smaller invasive species infestations. It basically involves using a black or darkly colored tarping material to cover the area where the invasive plants are growing. And if the invasive plant has a lot of top growth, you'll want to mow these plants first to basically get it down to bare soil or have very short stems. Then you'll stake down the tarp and leave in place for several months during the growing season. And essentially what you're doing here is like cooking or solarizing everything underneath as the soil heats up during the day. Again, you'll want to monitor it for regrowth, and in some cases for certain species like kudzu, they may just send out root nodes beyond the extent of the tarp, so you want to stay on top of pulling those back so that they don't escape. And lastly, if you have goats at your disposal, or you're able to hire the help of someone with a goat herd, they have insatiable appetites and they do a great job of top killing invasive plants, but I caution you that they will eat all of the good native stuff too. So those are some options for non-chemical use. We'll get into our next question here. With the bare soil and sunlight reaching the ground in new places, I'm concerned about invasives. Any recommendations for who to hire for control of invasive plants and replanting of hardwoods? Absolutely. I would be remiss if I didn't do a little plug for my really hardworking, caring, and knowledgeable eco-foresters field crews. We are available for hire and we conduct invasive plant control throughout the year, but there are also many other wonderful local hardworking contractors in our area that I'm going to mention here. And if you're not able to jot them down, we'll provide names for all of these folks later on. And so some of those contractors that I'd like to mention include Wildwood Consulting. They are located right here in Asheville. We've also got Raven Invasive Plant Management, which is a great option if you don't want any herbicide use. There's also Restora Flora, also based in the Asheville area. We've got Black Mountain Field and Forest. And for those of y'all who are looking to reseed or revegetate some of these bare soil areas, I highly recommend Wild Bud Natives, based out of Marshall, and the Carolina Native Nursery, which is based out of Burnsville. Thanks, y'all. I think that's the end of my time, and I'm going to turn it back to Ellie and Andy.
All right, so we've got a few questions. Sorry about that. We've got a few more questions about restoration, so I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
Yeah, so one of the big things, this is aimed at small landowners and usually 10 acres or less, which there's less resources in general available for forest management for smaller landowners, but you can have a much greater impact on your forest yourself. It's a much easier area to work in, so you can have a much greater impact in that smaller area. So you have a great opportunity here to have a real positive impact on your future forest now and some of this disturbance come back, and it is going to regenerate. Trees are going to regrow around here, especially where you don't have bare soil. If there's bare soil, we may not get regeneration happening there. You may have to plant. Definitely recommend planting in areas that bare soil exists, but you have native soils down, the trees will come back, and you can plant in those areas. It's important to realize that, again, trees are going to come back very thick and dense, and it's going to be a lot of vegetation. It could be probably large blackberry thickets coming in these areas that were disturbed by Helene. So there'll be a lot of vegetation coming in. If you plant something, you can't just plant it and walk away and think, oh, I planted a tree, great. You're going to have to go back and maintain that planting probably for at least a couple of years, maybe 5 years or so, possibly even longer, because some of the faster growing competition is going to be big thickets of yellow poplar, white pine, some of these very fast growing common trees that are meant to come in after disturbance. These kind of pioneer species are going to come in very thick and grow very fast. So you need to be prepared. If you're planting something like an oak, which is much slower growing, more desirable, and really needs our help to regenerate, then you're going to have to do some tending of these plantings. If it's in your yard, near your house, it's easy to do. You see it every day. You can go out there and you can see if there's weeds coming around it. You can control, mow around it and keep it, and you can prune it pretty easily. So you can do a lot better tending of them, which is much harder to do in a larger forest landscape. Competition is going to happen. You can't go in and maintain, 20 acres or more, but smaller acreages, you can do a lot more tending of what's coming up naturally on your property and things that you plant. And for planting or either favoring native natural regeneration that's happening anyway, I definitely recommend oaks. If you're not familiar with oaks, oaks are the keystone species for wildlife. And it's not just the acorns that are essential food source to get animals through the winter, but insects, the number of insects that live on oaks, like 500 species of moths and caterpillars live on oaks. And that means, big, fat, juicy caterpillars. And who doesn't love a big, fat, juicy caterpillar? That it is the keystone species for wildlife. And that's, birds rely on those caterpillars to feed their young in the spring. So it's absolutely essential. You'll get more birds around just one big oak tree than you will in other areas. So just a single big oak tree can have a tremendous benefit for wildlife. So I definitely recommend planting oaks. Hickories are a good option. They're hard to find by nurseries because they're very hard to transplant. And then if you want something a little more different, shortleaf pine is, again, a tree that's a little more resilient and hardy than the common native white pine. Shortleaf pines was a very common native trees, also a good tree for wildlife for planting things here. So those are the trees that I recommend in general as having more resilience. But again, nothing could withstand the areas where Helene really hit hard. So those are the trees that are most seen as being sturdier, they're all very long-lived trees, and they're great for wildlife. Anything that produces fruit, nuts or berries, whether it's a walnut tree or a cherry tree, also have benefits for wildlife as well. The other thing is, with again, those large holes in the canopy you had, trees knocked down, damaged, you can wait to the spring and see what's coming up naturally, and you can do what's called a crop tree release. We may have literally tens of thousands of trees per acre coming up in some of these areas that were disturbed. And it's going to be a lot of poplars, a lot of white pines. There might have been a lot of red maples left over in the understory from before, those shade-tolerant trees that were in the understory and were smaller. They're still there, and they may take over. So you may want to make sure you have more diversity. And I mentioned, like, oaks really need help. They're slower growing. They need some tending. You can plant those. You may find oaks coming up naturally. You may have some small oaks on your property, but they're going to need some help controlling the competition around them so that they'll have a chance to grow bigger, because they grow slower. So they're going to need some help to give them more space around them. So tending those oaks is really important. And planting them is great, but they will require some tending, again, for at least a couple of years, probably 5 years, maybe even 7 years, something like that, before they're big enough and they're ahead of the size of the poplars and the white pines and the other very common trees to go on that way. They used to have fire would knock down the other trees, and oaks would respond better to fire. They're fire adapted, but we don't have fire unless you want to do a prescribed burn, controlled burn on your property. You have to do that mechanically and control that competition to basically mimic the effects of fire naturally. The other thing about the downed trees on the property, and there is a fire risk, so get them away from your house, especially downhill from things here. It may not look good, and you can certainly clear them farther away from your house if you're worried about aesthetics of that. Other thing you can do, instead of actually removing them, which requires usually heavy machinery and is very expensive to remove those large down trees in the woods, you can simply have someone cut those trees so they're laying on the ground, because trees on the ground are going to decay much more quickly. All the mushrooms and organisms and insects in the soil will come up and start decaying that wood really very quickly. As a matter of fact, it's starting to happen already in some places. And this spring and summer, we'll start to see the beginnings of decay happening in the trees that are on the ground. The ones that are up in the air suspended are going to stay there much longer. So if you can cut them down, get them on the ground, or at least within about 3 feet of the ground, so they're underneath that brushy blackberry thicket, they stay a lot shadier and cool, and that helps decomposition happen a lot faster. So getting stuff down on the ground or close to the ground will really speed up the decay process, and that also is going to reduce your wildfire risk. As trees start to decay, they don't burn nearly as well, and eventually within, it'll take years, maybe even a decade or so, that stuff will start to decay where it's not flammable anymore. It basically is mulch. And that's the thing to realize, that all this down woody material on the ground in forest is not bad ecologically. That was something that was actually missing from a lot of our forests, because we have very young forests here. One picture I wanted to show you all was a picture from like the 1900s, where there literally are whole just mountainsides entirely barren. They came through and did a massive logging operation through the whole eastern U.S. really. And every tree around here was cut sometime in the past 100, maybe 150 years. And the forests we have now have come back from that. And that was not done with in forestry any intent. It was just simply cutting and running, getting those trees to the booming economy down on the coast. And so it was all clear cut. And what we saw before Helene was already second growth forest, or even third growth forest coming back from this past clear cutting. And it wasn't done with any intention. It wasn't done with any forestry professional involvement or expertise. It was just cutting the trees down and getting them out of there. So the trees are coming back. They will come back, and we can have a hand in shaping and getting hopefully a more desirable future forest coming back. And the other thing that was missing in this younger forest is we didn't have old growth trees that were just dying and falling over of old age, and then having this large woody material on the forest floor, which actually it's good mulch. It stops erosion. So if you had an area the trees fell down, they're actually helping to stop erosion by covering that ground, stopping direct rain impacts, and actually maybe even stopping some soil movement that's washing down if they're on the ground. So that they're working as mulch. As they break down and get decomposed by fungi and insects, bacteria, it's actually providing nutrients. It's restoring the forest floor. It's fertilizer to the forest essentially. So it's actually enriching soils as it breaks down, feeding the next generation of trees coming up. And the last thing is these coarse, especially the smaller brush piles, you can get it down 3 feet on the ground or lower. It's great wildlife habitat. There are tons of little critters that rely on these brush piles for shelter, for hiding from predators. And it becomes a whole big part of the food chain. Areas that have those brush piles have a much higher proportion of wildlife in them. So there's a lot of things we can do. That there are some benefits to leaving at least some piles of brush down on the ground in scattered areas is a good thing for wildlife. It may not look great, and that's a different consideration, but it is very expensive to try and remove all the trees. You don't have to remove them all. You can cut them down, get them on the ground, get them down low, and let them decay more rapidly that way. And it will recycle them, and there is good value for wildlife in there as well. So that's an important thing to mention on there. Someone asked a question about protected species designation fitting into forest planning. I'll address that real quickly. So basically anything that's federally listed as threatened or endangered does have federal law. The Endangered Species Act protects that, and that any threatened or endangered officially federally listed species cannot be disturbed legally. And there's penalties if you do. So we do want to, try and protect anything that is threatened or endangered, or even just some of the rarer plants, but there's no legal protection. Just they would have to actually be listed federally, and there is federal protection and what can be done where they know those things exist. If they don't know of them, then nothing. Then no one knows, but can't protect them. But if they know about them, they have to protect them. So that's and the key thing with again, all these trees that are going to naturally regenerate. You can just wait and maybe a year or 2 or 3 before we really see what trees are coming up. But you can go in there and look at the dense thicket of trees coming up and take a look and figure out which are the trees that are more desirable. It's going to be lots and lots of poplars and white pines coming up in most areas. I think maybe the most common trees. There might be, again, those red maples and those sour, other very shade tolerant trees that are already in there kind of taking over. But there may be some oaks and maybe some hickories and there may be some shortleaf pines. They actually like bare soil to grow on. So there may be some of these more uncommon trees that have been declining greatly over the past 100 years. And now we can actually may have an opportunity to find those trees that are regenerating and favor them by controlling the competition around them to help them grow and have a hand in shaping the future forest that is coming to make it a more diverse forest, healthier, because diversity helps forest health, make it better for wildlife, make it more aesthetically pleasing by choosing the trees that you want to have in your forest. Because again, things are going to regrow, and there is an opportunity here for us to help shape the forest and have it come back at least as good as before, maybe even better. It'll take time, but there is lots of potential, and things grow really well here. We live in the most biodiverse forest outside of the tropics. The Southern Appalachians are the most biodiverse forest. So there's tons of biodiversity here. Things grow really well here. So there's a lot of potential that we have to work with here. So, okay, a couple of trees come in. Trees that were uprooted. Yeah, this was a common phenomenon. So again, that certainly doesn't look great in your landscaped areas. And so in a landscaped area, you probably could have someone come in. You need someone that's an arborist that can cut that stump off. It is possible to even then turn those stumps back upright, put them back in the hole if you cut the tree off of it there. It is an expensive and challenging process, usually involving machinery to get that stump back in the ground. And then you probably do want to grind the stump down, the actual woody stump down, but you can actually kind of put that stump and all the dirt back in the hole. It is possible. Not easy, not cheap process. You also can have machinery come in and get rid of the stump, grind the stump and smooth it out again. Then you have to get some bare soil. You got to replant seeds there. But again, those tip-up mounds are also a natural process that does provide, again, a little different microhabitat. A little hole in the ground can collect water. You can have aquatic organisms in there that grow in there. It's a little fresh mineral soil is turned up by the tip-over mound. So it also provides, there are strange trees that grow on top of those tip-up mounds, and it actually gives them a couple foot head start because they're growing on top of this tip-up mound. This old root ball got tipped up. And you'll see birch trees do this. They'll grow on top of that, and that'll give them a 3 or 4 foot head start. And then as that tree decays, they'll actually have stilts coming down. You see these crazy stilt trees where the roots are actually in the air, because there used to be a stump that was in here. They grew on top of the stump or a root ball, and the roots went around that, and then the stump rots away, and you actually have a stilt tree where the roots look like stilts. And birches are one tree that does that. It's a kind of a cool evolutionary adaptation that that has some advantages. But again, aesthetically, it may not look good, and that's, you have to have, you know, landscapers or someone come in to kind of get rid of those root balls if you want that done. But again, in terms of ecologically, they're actually fine, and a natural phenomenon happened at a far greater frequency than anyone wanted or expected right now. But yeah, not necessarily a bad thing. Are there other questions coming in, Ellie? Or if you've got questions, feel free to chime in. Doesn't have a way to.
Yeah, so if anyone has any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. We'll wait a minute or two for that.
Have with people, if a number of resources that I've mentioned that we can share with people. There's Firewise is a great resource that gives you information on protecting your house. There's a small stream restoration handout we have that tells you if you have a stream that got damaged by erosion. A lot of streams had a lot of damage to their banks and stuff. It's very important to restabilize those stream banks. There's a handout that gives you some good basic information on that. And there's lots of invasive species information online. You can research anything and everything you want pretty much for that as well.
Yeah, so if anyone is interested in any of these handouts, we will be sending out our top 10 invasive species list and the best way to identify and control them. We have handouts on erosion and EFRP. So if anyone's interested in that, you can click the link in the description to register, or you can message us on Facebook or Instagram, or you can email me. My email is on the screen. Okay, and it looks like we got another question. So I will pass this back to Krishun.
Hi, Hope. Thanks for your question. So the question was, if you treat invasives with the cut and dab method, do you also need to pull them down and remove them? No, you don't have to. I know what a crazy feat that would be if you were also expected to try to pull down all those bittersweet and kudzu vines. So what we do is we just leave the vines up in the trees. I know it might look unsightly, but they'll rot over time. And because you've severed that connection to its root system, it will no longer circulate fluids and it won't photosynthesize. So those plants up there will die, the vines that are hanging in the trees. With regards to some specific non-native invasive shrub species like multiflora rose or privet or burning bush, I will take the extra step to dab the cut end of the shrub that I just cut down, because autumn olive I would include in that list too. What I've seen is when I lay them down on the ground, and if they have ample access to moisture and sunlight, sometimes I've seen that laid down privet sprout out little roots from the side of the branch and the twigs, and it'll like just go on living, unfortunately. So with shrubs, I take the extra step to dab the ends of those, or I'll hang them in a tree, or just put them somewhere a little elevated off the ground so that they don't have a chance to touch that soil. We got another question come through. Do you have any guidance on using wood chips? Is wood chipping a lot of the fallen tree branches a good idea to help them break down faster? And I can certainly let Andy chime in on this one too, but I do think that using wood chips from on site would be a positive thing and a good thing. Andy, do you have any further insight into using wood chips?
Yeah, in terms of getting rid of the large woody debris on the ground, you can bring in a forestry mulching machine or a wood chipper and feed into wood chipper, and it will make things break down a lot faster. You chip it up and spread it out over the ground. Those wood chips will break down a lot faster than a whole solid log would. So certainly wood chipping will speed up the decay process in those areas, and that's a good natural way to recycle that wood there. And then a very similar question someone asked was about the North Carolina Forest Service pile the buck logs and then leave them on the ground where they fall. And this it will prevent fire spray. So breaking up having not continuous fuels. If you do have a big pile of wood chips are going to break down really very quickly in a couple of years, a year or two or three. They're going to break down and really not be flammable anymore. But larger woody stuff, if you can pile it up a little bit, making those brush piles for wildlife, it also breaks up the fuels. You don't have continuous fuels. If you have just trees down across the whole landscape everywhere, and the fire can be carried by those fuels everywhere. So piling up some of the fuels and breaking that fuel, it would not be continuous fuel, again, especially if it's below your house where it can spread uphill quickly, to break it up and have those fire breaks. If you have an old road in there, clear that road so you have a fire break between any fuels in your house to stop that. Can be a good thing for fire risk. Definitely stopping the fire from spreading, having those breaks in the fuel is a great thing to do. That can just be moving stuff around. Yep. But again, you usually need machinery to do that. We do not have machinery ourselves, but we have a list of contractors that we or our clients have worked with, a number of contractors that do forestry mulching, come in, actually a machine that can just come in and grind up trees that are on the ground. There are some limits on the size of it. Other thing you can have machines come in, excavators come in and pick up the trees and put them in a truck and haul them off. That is expensive. But there are companies that can do that as well for things that can remove some of that fuel and break it up at least. Yep. It's all good advice.